On November 29, 1944, the largest aircraft carrier ever built slipped beneath the waves of the Pacific Ocean, taking 435 men with her. She'd been at sea for 17 hours. The IJN Shinano, third ship of the legendary Yamato-class, converted from battleship to carrier in a desperate attempt to replace losses at Midway, sank because of decisions made in Tokyo boardrooms, because of corners cut under pressure, because rushing construction and neglecting training creates vulnerabilities that no amount of armor can protect against. The Shinano was never supposed to be a carrier. Her keel was laid in May 1940 at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal as the third Yamato-class super battleship, a sister to Yamato and Musashi, the largest and most powerful battleships ever constructed. The plan called for a ship displacing over 70,000 tons, mounting 9 18.1-inch guns, armored to withstand any weapon afloat. She would be invincible. Then came Midway. In one day, June 4th, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kagasoryu, and Hiryu. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, were gone. Japan's carrier strength was gutted. The strategic situation shifted instantly from offensive expansion to defensive desperation. Work on Shinano's battleship hull was roughly 50% complete when the order came down: convert her to an aircraft carrier. The logic seemed sound. Japan needed carriers urgently. Building a carrier from scratch would take years. Converting the partially complete Shinano might be faster. The massive hull could support an enormous flight deck. The battleship armor would make her survivable against air attack. She'd be the ultimate armored carrier, a mobile fortress that could absorb damage and keep fighting. The reality was far more complicated. Converting a battleship hull to a carrier while construction was already underway created engineering nightmares. The Yamato-class ships were designed for surface combat, thick armor, underwater protection against torpedoes, heavy compartmentalization. The internal layout optimized for magazines, engine rooms, and fire control systems. None of that translated well to carrier requirements. Carriers need aircraft hangars, munitions, storage, aviation, fuel tanks, maintenance spaces, and elevators to move aircraft between the hangar and flight deck. The Shinano's designers tried to fit carrier systems into a battleship framework. The result was compromise stacked on compromise. The hangar space was relatively small for a ship that size. She could carry only 47 aircraft operationally, with room for 47 more in storage. American carriers, half her displacement, carried more operational aircraft. The armored flight deck made sense in theory. The deck was 8 inches thick, in places thick enough to resist bomb hits that would punch through the wooden decks of most carriers. But armor is heavy. The thick deck and the battleship hull structure made Shinano extraordinarily heavy, even by battleship standards. She displaced 72,000 tons, fully loaded, making her the heaviest carrier ever built. That weight required enormous engine power just to move at reasonable speed. Her maximum speed was only 27 knots slow, for a carrier slow enough that she couldn't keep up with the faster carriers in the fleet. The conversion work dragged on far longer than planned. The naval arsenal was already overworked. Skilled labor was in short supply. Experienced shipbuilders were dying in combat zones or had been drafted. Air raids disrupted construction. Materials shortages delayed work. The November 1944 completion date was arbitrary, driven by operational need rather than realistic assessment of what could be accomplished. When Shinano finally left the yard, she was incomplete. Hundreds of watertight doors and hatches weren't properly secured. Ventilation systems hadn't been tested. Some compartments still had construction materials and tools scattered around. Electrical systems were partially functional. The damage control training for the crew was minimal. Many crew members had been aboard for only days. They didn't know the ship. They didn't know where the critical damage control equipment was located. They'd never practiced flooding drills. Captain Toshio Abe knew the ship wasn't ready. He'd push for more time, more training, more shakedown trials. The Naval General Staff refused. American forces were advancing through the Philippines. B-29 bombers were hitting Japan itself. The air raids on Tokyo were intensifying. Shinano needed to be moved to Kura Naval Base for final fitting out, and she needed to move immediately before American aircraft could catch her in Yokosuka. The crew was a mixture of experienced sailors and raw recruits. Many were survivors from other sunken ships, traumatized men who'd already watched their vessels go down. Others were fresh from training teenagers who'd never been to sea. The civilian shipyard workers who remained aboard to complete final work during the transit numbered in the hundreds. They weren't trained for damage control. They didn't even know where the life raft kits were stowed. On November 28, 1944, Shinano departed Yokosuka Bay, escorted by 3 destroyers, Isokaze Yukikaze and Hamikaze. The destroyers were veterans, fast and capable, but 3 escorts were inadequate for a ship of Shinano's value. Standard doctrine called for at least 6 destroyers to properly screen a carrier, but Japan didn't have destroyers to spare. Everything was stretched thin. The plan was simple transit at high speed to Kure, stay close to the coast, where shallow water would deter submarines arrive within 24 hours. Abe pushed the ship to 20 knots, which was all he could safely manage with untested engines. The route took them through waters known to be patrolled by American submarines, but intelligence suggested no submarines were in the immediate area. Intelligence was wrong. The USS Archerfish, a Balao-class submarine commanded by Commander Joseph Enright, was running on the surface at night, heading for patrol station. Lookouts spotted the massive silhouette against the moon. Enright initially thought it was a destroyer, but as the range closed, he realized he was looking at something far larger. The pagoda mast structure suggested a battleship or heavy cruiser. Whatever it was huge and important. Archerfish dove and began pursuit. The Japanese formation was zigzagging, but the pattern was predictable. Enright worked to get ahead of the target to position Archerfish for an attack. The submarine ran submerged at maximum speed batteries, draining the crew, sweating in the heat as the electric motors pushed the boat to its limits. For hours, Archerfish chased. Enright couldn't get into position. The target was too fast, the escorts too alert. He was about to give up when the Japanese formation zigged toward him. Suddenly, Archerfish was in perfect position, 400 yards from the target's track. Enright ordered tubes ready. The fire control solution was updated. He waited for the optimal firing angle. At 03:17 on November 29th, Archerfish fired 6 torpedoes. The spread was perfect, aimed to hit along the length of the target's hull. Enright watched through the periscope as the torpedoes ran true. The range was close enough that he could see the ship clearly, a massive hull flight deck visible in the moonlight. This wasn't a battleship. It was a carrier. And it was the biggest carrier he'd ever seen. 4 torpedoes hit. The explosions were massive, tearing holes in Shinano's starboard side. The battleship hull's underwater protection was designed to resist torpedo hits, layers of compartments and bulkheads that would contain flooding. But the protection system wasn't complete. Watertight doors hadn't been properly sealed. Ventilation trunks ran through compartments that should have been isolated. Water poured through the gaps, spreading far beyond the initial damage. The damage control parties responded, but they didn't know the ship well enough to be effective. They couldn't locate the valves to isolate flooded compartments. They tried to shore up bulkheads with timbers, but didn't have proper equipment. Some tried to plug holes with mattresses and blankets. The civilian workers panicked. They weren't trained for this, weren't prepared to die. Captain Abe initially believed the ship could survive. Shinano was huge, heavily armoured, built to battleship standards of survivability. 4 torpedo hits shouldn't be fatal. He ordered counter-flooding to correct the list, ordered damage control parties to contain the flooding, increased speed to try to reach shallow water before the situation deteriorated. But the flooding continued. Water spread through unsealed compartments. The list increased. Pumps couldn't keep up. Electrical systems began failing as water reached switchboards. Lighting failed in sections of the ship. Communications broke down. The engineering spaces reported rising water levels. The ship was dying, and there was nothing the crew could do to save her. At 0600, Abe finally accepted reality. He ordered abandon ship. The destroyers came alongside to take off crew, but the operation was chaotic. Many crew members couldn't reach the weather decks they were trapped below, as flooding cut off escape routes. The civilian workers unfamiliar with the ship got lost in the darkened passageways. Some jumped into the water and drowned. Others went down with the ship. At 10:57, 7 hours after the torpedo hits, Shinano capsized and sank. She'd been afloat less than 20 hours since leaving Yokosuka. The largest carrier ever built lost on her maiden voyage. Of the approximately 2,500 people aboard, 1,435 died. The destroyers rescued what survivors they could, but many men went down with the ship or died in the water. Archerfish escaped without damage. Enright knew he'd sunk something big, but he didn't know exactly what. His report mentioned a carrier battleship or large carrier. The Navy credited him with sinking a 28,000-ton carrier, a significant underestimate. Only after the war, when Japanese records became available, did the truth emerge. Archerfish had sunk the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine. The Shinano's loss encapsulated Japan's strategic situation in late 1944. The decision to convert her from battleship to carrier showed desperation, abandoning the battleship program that had been the pride of the Navy, rushing to replace carrier losses that couldn't be replaced fast enough. The incomplete state of the ship showed industrial collapse. Not enough workers, not enough time, not enough materials to do the job properly. The inadequate escort showed naval weakness. 3 destroyers to guard the Navy's most valuable ship was criminally insufficient, but Japan didn't have more destroyers available. They were scattered across the Pacific, escorting convoys that were being decimated by American submarines supporting garrisons on bypassed islands, dying in hopeless battles. The crew's lack of training showed the collapse of Japan's personnel system. The experienced sailors who might have saved the ship were dead. The training program couldn't produce replacements fast enough. The quality of new recruits declined steadily as the war continued. By late 1944, Japanese crews were shadows of their 1941 predecessors. The damage control failures showed systemic problems. Shinano's survivability depended on her crew knowing the ship, knowing the damage control procedures, being trained and drilled until the responses were automatic. None of that training happened. The ship went to sea before the crew was ready, before the ship itself was ready, because operational pressures demanded it. Every decision made sense individually. Convert the battleship hull because you need carriers. Rush the completion because air raids threaten the shipyard. Move the ship with minimal escort because escorts are needed elsewhere. Use available crew even if they're inexperienced because experienced sailors don't exist. Each decision was rational given the circumstances. Together, they guaranteed disaster. The engineering challenges of the conversion were probably solvable given enough time. The Yamato-class hull was magnificently engineered. The underwater protection system, when properly completed, was among the best ever designed. The armor would have made Shinano incredibly resistant to air attack. She might have been exactly what Japan needed: a carrier that could survive in an environment of American air superiority. But she never got the chance. The rushed construction left critical systems incomplete. The watertight integrity that might have contained the torpedo damage didn't exist. The crew that might have executed damage control effectively wasn't trained. The escorts that might have kept Archerfish from getting into attack position weren't available. 4 torpedoes from a single submarine sank the largest carrier ever built. Not because the torpedoes were particularly effective. They were standard. Mark to 14 torpedoes. The same weapons that had plagued American submarines earlier in the war. Not because Archerfish did anything extraordinary. Enright made a good attack, but it was conventional submarine tactics. Shinano sank because she wasn't ready for sea, and she went to sea anyway. The loss rippled through the Japanese Navy. If Shinano could sink on her maiden voyage, what did that say about other ships? If the mighty Yamato-class hull couldn't survive 4 torpedo hits, what chance did older ships have? If the Navy couldn't properly protect its most valuable unit, How could it protect anything? The strategic impact was minimal only because Shinano never became operational. She never launched aircraft. She never participated in combat. She was a potential asset that never materialized. But the loss damaged morale. It confirmed what many in the Navy already knew. Japan was losing the war and losing the capacity to build the weapons needed to change that fact. Commander Enright and Archerfish became famous. The submarine community celebrated the sinking as the largest submarine kill in history, a record that still stands. Enright received the Navy Cross. The crew received recognition. They'd done their job brilliantly. Captain Abe and most of his senior officers died with the ship. They stayed aboard trying to save her went down when she capsized. Abe faced court-martial if he survived taking a brand new carrier to sea, and losing her on the first day was the kind of failure that demanded accountability. He chose to die with his ship rather than face the consequences. The survivors carried trauma for the rest of their lives. They'd been aboard the most powerful carrier in the world for less than a day before it sank beneath them. Some spent hours in the water before rescue. Many watched friends drown. The psychological impact of that experience, the sudden transition from pride in serving aboard a supercarrier to swimming for your life in the Pacific, was devastating. The wreck of Shinano has never been found. She went down in deep water off the coast of Honshu. The exact location is uncertain. She's out there somewhere. 17,000 feet down, perhaps. The massive hull resting on the seafloor, the armored flight deck that was supposed to make her invincible, collapsed or buried in sediment. The largest carrier ever built, lost before she could prove her worth, a monument to desperation and haste, and the fatal consequences of cutting corners. The third Yamato was supposed to be invincible. She lasted 17 hours.